It is the Soviet Union, the late 1960s. In a quiet town, tucked away from the noise of Moscow or the upheavals of politics, lives a woman who, at first glance, couldn't be more ordinary. Her name is Antonina Ginsburg. Neighbors describe her as a little shy, almost modest. She goes about her days without drawing attention, her hair neatly tied back, her steps quick but unhurried. She works as a controller in a sewing workshop, spending long hours inspecting rows of fabric and checking stitches. At home, she is the mother of 2 daughters. She keeps a tidy apartment, the kind where the scent of fresh soup lingers, where neighbors feel comfortable stopping by for tea. She belongs to a respected Soviet family. Her husband and she are decorated military veterans. Her relatives carry the weight of war medals pinned to their jackets. Their walls are lined with photographs of smiling men in uniform, their shelves heavy with military awards. In a country that reveres sacrifice and victory, the Ginsburg family is held up as an example of patriotism. To the outside world, Antonina is part of this proud lineage. She is quiet, dutiful, respectable. She walks her daughters to school, attends parades, and greets people in the street with a soft smile. An ordinary Soviet woman, or so it seemed. Because behind this mask of normalcy, Antonina carried a secret darker than anyone could imagine. She was not merely a woman of the war generation. She was not simply a veteran, a wife, a mother. She had another name, one spoken only in whispers in the files of wartime investigators, a name that villagers remembered with horror and survivors spat out with hatred. That name was Tonka the Machine Gunner. The truth was staggering. Years earlier, during the Nazi occupation of Soviet lands, Antonina Makarova, her real name, had stood not with her people but against them. She had served the occupiers, and she had not just collaborated, she had killed. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. Eyewitnesses remembered the image of a young woman standing before lines of Soviet prisoners, hands steady as she pulled the trigger of a machine gun. Men, women, and even children collapsing into pits, blood soaking the soil. Children screaming, and Antonina, calm, as if following orders was enough to absolve her of conscience. And yet somehow, after the war ended, she vanished. She slipped into a new identity, married, built a family, lived a life so carefully ordinary that for decades no one questioned her. Until one day, Soviet investigators dusted off an old file. They followed a trail, one thin thread that had been overlooked, and they realized that the quiet, shy seamstress in their town was no ordinary woman at all. She was Tonka the Machine Gunner. The question hangs in the air. How did a woman who executed hundreds of her own people manage to hide in plain sight for so long? And more hauntingly, what kind of person was she? A desperate survivor, or a willing Nazi monster in the uniform of an ordinary woman? March 1st, 1920. In a small Russian village, a baby girl is born into poverty. Her name is Antonina Panfilova. She is the youngest of 7 children, a hungry mouth in a household where food is never quite enough. The Russia of her childhood is harsh, marked by civil war, famine, and endless uncertainty. Antonina grows up quickly, barefoot, running across muddy roads, helping with chores, and watching her older siblings leave home one by one. From the start, she carries a mark of confusion in her very identity. When Antonina is 7 years old, she walks nervously into her village school for the first time. The teacher asks her name. Shy and embarrassed, she stays quiet. A classmate, trying to help, blurts out, "She's Makarova, by her father Makar." It was wrong, of course. Her father's name was not her surname, but the teacher wrote it down without hesitation. And so, from that moment on, in every document, every school book, and eventually even in her passport and Komsomol membership card, the little girl ceased to be Antonina Panfilova. She became Antonina Makarova. Her parents never corrected the mistake. Maybe it didn't matter much to them in those years of survival, but it would matter later, when investigators tried to track her down. The name Makarova was both an accident and the cloak that would one day help her disappear. As a teenager, Antonina dreamed of leaving her village life behind. She enrolled in a medical college, hoping to become a doctor. It was a respectable path, and for a while, she appeared destined for an ordinary, even useful life. But history had other plans. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The world she knew collapsed overnight. Cities were bombed, villages burned, families scattered. Millions were called to the front. Antonina, just 21 years old, volunteered, not as a soldier, but as a sanitary worker and buffet girl for the Red Army. She served food, tended to the wounded, carried buckets of water. For a time, she lived at the very edge of the front lines, a Soviet girl surrounded by death, fire, and panic. But the Red Army suffered devastating defeats in those first months. Entire units were swallowed by the German blitzkrieg. One day, Antonina's group was overrun. The soldiers she worked with were killed or captured. She fled into the forests, terrified, hiding among the trees, surviving for several days on whatever scraps she could find. Then, she was captured. German soldiers arrested her and others who had tried to escape. For many, that meant execution. But Antonina was lucky, or so it seemed. With her was a soldier named Nikolai Fedchuk. At some point, the two managed to slip away, escaping German hands. For months they wandered together, ragged, hungry, half alive, trying to break through the front lines. Later, under interrogation, Antonina would admit that she had been too frightened to be alone. She clung to Fedchuk, offering herself as his campaign wife. A grim arrangement, born of fear and desperation. In January 1942, after endless wandering, the pair finally reached Fedchuk's home village of Krasny Kolodets. There, however, everything changed. Nikolai had a wife and children waiting for him. Whatever bond had existed on the road, it ended at his doorstep. He reunited with his family, and Antonina was left behind. She begged him not to abandon her, but he refused. That moment may have broken something inside her. Alone again, traumatized and discarded, Antonina seemed to spiral. Some historians later suggested that she may have suffered a kind of mental collapse. Others believed that the months of fear, violence, and displacement stripped away her ability to care about right or wrong. For a short time, the women of Krasny Kolodets helped her, offering shelter and food. But soon, they turned against her. Antonina had begun living recklessly, taking lovers freely, scandalizing the conservative villagers. Whispers spread that she was unstable, shameless, dangerous. Her intimate life was messy. By spring, she was forced to leave the village. It was a fateful exile. The war had left Antonina rootless. She was no longer a fighter, no longer the girl who dreamed of medical school. She was not part of Fedchuk's family, not wanted in Krasny Kolodets. And in the chaos of occupied territory, with Soviet lines far away and Nazi forces entrenched, she had nowhere to go. It was in this vulnerable state, isolated, humiliated, desperate, that Antonina's path began to bend toward collaboration. Because soon, she would encounter people who offered her food, shelter, and a place in their world. They were not Soviets. They were not partisans. They were the enemy. And Antonina, scarred and adrift, would make the choice that turned her from a frightened girl into something far darker. The transformation had begun. The winter of 1942 was bitter in more ways than one. Antonina Makarova drifted like a ghost across occupied villages, never staying long enough to belong. She begged, bartered, and sometimes sold herself for scraps of bread or a night under a roof. The villagers whispered about her shamelessness, about the young woman who seemed unmoored from everything: family, duty, morality itself. Eventually, her wandering brought her to the town of Lokot, deep in Nazi-occupied territory. Lokot was no ordinary settlement. It was the heart of the so-called Lokot autonomy, a collaborationist mini-state run by Russian auxiliaries under German oversight. Here, life looked different than in the starving, fearful villages nearby. Russian policemen strutted in uniforms. Their families lived in warm houses. Their tables had food. Compared to the squalor of the peasants, collaborators lived very comfortably. At first, Antonina found shelter with a local woman. But she had nothing to offer in return. No money, no family ties, no skills worth bartering. She was about to approach the partisans, hoping to join their ranks, when she noticed how well-fed, well-dressed, and confident the Russian collaborators were. And in that moment, a seed was planted. Why choose hunger, danger, and suspicion when survival lay on the other side? Antonina decided to cross the line. For a time, she survived by prostituting herself to German soldiers and local police. It was degrading, but it bought her bread, a bed, and protection. More importantly, it revealed something to her overseers. Antonina was willing to do anything to survive. And then, one day, the offer came. The occupiers had prisoners to execute, Soviet partisans, suspected sympathizers, even entire families condemned for resistance. The German officers and their Russian enforcers had no desire to do the dirty work themselves. Killing unarmed men, women, and teenagers face to face was something they preferred to avoid. They wanted someone expendable, someone desperate, someone who could be both pitiless and detached. That someone was Antonina. She would later tell investigators, "I only wanted to survive after so many wanderings." When the Germans questioned me, I began cursing Soviet power. Out of fear, I agreed to serve. The head of the Lokot Republic, Bronislav Kaminsky, handed her a Maxim machine gun. Her job was simple: carry out death sentences. Her new home was a room at the local stud farm. There she kept her machine gun. There she also hoarded the clothes of the executed, which she used as her own. One woman, who had once sheltered Antonina for a night in Krasny Kholodets, came to ask for help. What she found terrified her. In the room were heaps of clothing and the heavy Maxim gun. Antonina told her quite casually about the executions and her new role. The woman fled in horror. The first execution was the hardest. Antonina stood before a line of condemned prisoners, men in ragged clothing, some young, some old. They were paraded to a pit outside of town. She was supposed to fire, but when the moment came, she froze. Her hands shook. She could not pull the trigger. The Germans noticed. They poured her a glass of alcohol, forcing her to drink until her head spun. And then, drunk and half-dazed, she fired. Bodies fell into the pit. From then on, she didn't need the alcohol. Over time, she became efficient. Her name spread: Tonka the Machine Gunner. The routine was always the same. A group of prisoners, usually about 27, the number that fit into the jail cell, would be let out. A wooden board hung from some of their necks marked "Partisan." They were marched to a pit, about 500 meters from the prison. Antonina's machine gun was wheeled out by one of the men. She would kneel, take position, and at the order, open fire. She later described it with chilling detachment. "I didn't know those I shot. They didn't know me. So I wasn't ashamed before them. Sometimes, when someone twitched, I shot again in the head so they wouldn't suffer." Some sang songs before death. After the executions, I cleaned my machine gun in the yard. Ammunition was plentiful. For me, all those condemned were the same. Only their numbers changed. Usually it was 27, sometimes more, sometimes entire families. By her own estimate, she carried out dozens upon dozens of such executions. Historians believe she killed hundreds, possibly close to 1,500 people. She recalled one particular moment years later. A young man about to die looked at her and shouted, "We'll never meet again. Farewell, sister." That memory lingered. But otherwise, Antonina admitted, she felt no guilt. For her, the shootings were just another part of war, an ugly but routine necessity. Eyewitnesses would later describe the fear she inspired. Prisoners, hearing that they were to be executed, sometimes collapsed before even reaching the pit. To be killed by a young Russian woman, a woman with dark hair and a blank face, firing calmly into their bodies, seemed almost more monstrous than dying at the hands of uniformed men. And still, Antonina adapted. She ate well. She wore clothes stripped from the dead. She had her own room. Compared to the starving peasants, she lived like a queen. The price of that comfort was blood. In Lokot, her reputation grew. To some, she was a freakish curiosity, a woman executioner, the female devil with the Maxim machine gun. To others, she was simply a useful tool, someone the Germans could rely on to do what they preferred not to. Among the many terrible stories from Lokot, one testimony stands out. A boy no older than 7 or 8 was once led with a group to the place of execution. He stood in the line, heard the rattle of Antonina's machine gun, and fell with the others. By sheer chance, or fate, he was untouched by the bullets. Terrified, he lay still beneath the weight of bodies until night fell. Then, crawling free, he stumbled to a nearby village and told the elders what he had seen. His account spread quickly. A young woman, calm, with a machine gun, mowing down prisoners. For the villagers, it confirmed their worst fears. The executioner had a name now, Tonka the Machine Gunner. Her own words, decades later, stripped the horror bare. The executions did not torment my conscience. They seemed to me not something unusual, but merely the costs of wartime. By the end of her time in Lokot, she had become notorious. No longer the frightened girl who wandered villages, no longer the abandoned companion of married soldier Fedchuk, no longer the nameless student with dreams of medicine. She was Tonka the Machine Gunner, a name that would echo in Soviet memory as one of the darkest female collaborators of the war. By the spring of 1942, Antonina Makarova was no longer just an oddity in the German-occupied town of Lokot. She had become indispensable. The Nazis had found their executioner, and she embraced the role with a chilling steadiness. Executions weren't rare, they were routine. On some days, she carried them out once. On others, 2 or 3 times in a single afternoon. Groups of prisoners, men, women, even children, were marched to the edge of a pit, usually 25 to 30 at a time. They were told to stand in a line facing the trench, often with a crude sign around their neck. Partisan. Antonina would set up her Maxim machine gun, kneel, and wait for the order. Then she fired. Bullets tore through bodies. People collapsed into the pit, one on top of another. Those still twitching were finished with a final shot to the head. And then it would happen again the next day. And the day after. The numbers blurred. The screams faded into background noise. By the end of her service, Antonina had executed an estimated 1,500 people. Official Soviet investigations, decades later, were able to identify only 168 by name. The rest, hundreds upon hundreds, remain nameless, reduced to dust in mass graves. It wasn't just partisans. It wasn't just men who had taken up arms. The condemned included wives, mothers, old men, even children unlucky enough to be suspected of helping the resistance. For Antonina, it made no difference. She later confessed, "All those sentenced were the same to me. Only their numbers changed, and for her work, she was paid. 30 Reichsmarks per execution. The detail was impossible to ignore. 30 pieces of silver, like Judas." Her blood money became infamous in Soviet retellings of her crimes, but Antonina wanted more than coins. After each killing, she picked through the bodies for clothing. A warm coat, a dress, a scarf. If she liked it, she took it. Why let good things go to waste? she explained years later, as if that made sense of the grotesque habit. The problem was that the clothes were never truly hers. They came with bullet holes, with dark stains that no washing could remove. She would wear them anyway. Neighbors remembered seeing her dressed in outfits that once belonged to the dead, as if she carried their shadows on her back. Eyewitnesses said she often prowled the stables that had been turned into a makeshift prison. At night, she walked among the cells, studying the prisoners, staring at them with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't pity. It wasn't compassion. Some said it was as if she was selecting which clothes she wanted in advance, as though the prisoners were mannequins waiting to be stripped after their deaths. One villager recalled a chilling image: Antonina stepping out of the prison yard with a whip in hand, cracking it casually in the air as if to remind everyone who she was. Fear spread like smoke through the countryside. Her name became a curse whispered in barns and around campfires: Tonka the Machine Gunner. She was not seen as a poor girl forced into compromise. She was seen as a monster in a skirt, a traitor who had traded her people's lives for comfort and coins. Partisans talked of hunting her down. Some swore they would make her pay, but she was always under German protection. To touch her meant to take on the entire Lokot police and their Nazi overseers. And so she survived, untouchable, while those around her perished. The psychology of it all still confounds historians. Was it simply survival instinct? The desperate need of a starving, abandoned girl to cling to the only system that offered her food, warmth, and protection? Or was there something darker inside her? A cruelty that surfaced once the opportunity came. Antonina herself never admitted to sadism. In her interrogations decades later, she insisted she only wanted to live. She had no personal grudges against those she killed. She didn't even know their names. And because she didn't know them, she felt no shame. But survivors remembered something else. They remembered her calmness, how she never trembled, how she fired with the steadiness of a soldier, not a frightened girl. Some said she even seemed bored, as if she were completing a dull routine. The Germans admired her efficiency. To them, she was useful, a woman who spared them the psychological burden of shooting captives at close range. She saved them from having to bloody their own hands. For her, they provided lodging, clothes, protection. To the locals, however, she was a nightmare. A devil cloaked in a woman's body, a symbol of betrayal. And in that contrast, useful tool to the occupiers, soulless executioner to her own people, Antonina Makarova's reputation grew. She had crossed the line from survivor to something else entirely. The girl who once dreamed of becoming a nurse, of healing wounds, had become the most feared executioner in the Lokot Republic. And with every burst of the Maxim gun, she pushed herself deeper into history as one of the darkest figures of the war. By 1943, the war had shifted. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, began to push back with a vengeance. Stalingrad had fallen to the Soviets. The German dream of easy conquest was collapsing. And in villages like Lokot, where Antonina Makarova carried out her grim work, the winds of war were changing direction. The Nazis knew it. Their collaborators knew it. And deep down, Antonina must have felt it too. The fortress of German occupation began to crumble. Villagers who had cowered in silence now whispered of retribution. Partisans grew bolder, striking harder, slipping into towns with vengeance in their eyes. Soon, the noose would tighten. For Antonina, life in Lokot had never been just about the executions. She had also carved out a reputation for herself in the darker corners of the town's nightlife. Witnesses later recalled that she often appeared at the local music club, a place of forced cheer, where German soldiers drank heavily, played cards, and sought out the company of women. Antonina was always there. She drank hard, laughed loudly, and as many recounted, took German soldiers and policemen as lovers. Sometimes for money, sometimes for gifts, sometimes simply because it was available. She kept no close friends among the other women. She didn't trust them. She lived recklessly, detached, as if numbing herself to the horror she enacted by day. But this reckless indulgence carried its price. By the summer of 1943, Antonina contracted syphilis. The Germans, unwilling to lose a useful asset, removed her from Lokot and sent her deep into the rear, to a military hospital for treatment. That twist of fate, a disease contracted through her chaotic life, saved her from capture. Because on September 5, 1943, the Red Army liberated Lokot. The prison where Antonina had carried out her mass shootings was opened. Survivors emerged. Collaborators were hunted down. Some were shot on the spot. Others were dragged into the public square and beaten, spat upon, executed. If Antonina had still been there, she almost certainly would have faced that fate. Instead, she was far away, in the safety of German-controlled territory. When she recovered, she didn't return to her post. Perhaps she knew it was too late. Perhaps she sensed the Soviets closing in. Instead, she found herself drifting once again, slipping into another identity, another story. In the German rear, Antonina began a relationship with a German cook, a low-ranking corporal, an ordinary man who saw in her not Tonka the Machine Gunner, but simply a woman. He smuggled her away in his supply convoy, hiding her among barrels and sacks of food as they retreated westward. First into Ukraine, then further into Poland. Always on the move, always escaping. For Antonina, it must have felt like a second chance, a possibility of slipping away completely, leaving behind the blood and the whispers, erasing Tonka from existence. But war rarely allowed clean escapes. Somewhere in Poland, her German lover was killed, just another faceless casualty of a war drowning in them. Antonina, once again alone, was left to the mercy of the German system. She was shipped to Königsberg, placed in a concentration camp. Not as a victim, but as a displaced wanderer, one of thousands of women caught in the machinery of war. For a time, she disappeared from the record. Meanwhile, in Lokot, the stories of Tonka the Machine Gunner spread like wildfire. Survivors told investigators of the calm, detached woman with the submachine gun who had executed their brothers, sisters, parents. Villagers whispered of how she would visit the prison at night, eyeing prisoners, as if selecting clothes from a macabre catalog. Others recalled her swinging a whip, smirking as she walked past lines of the condemned. The partisans swore vengeance, but their target was gone. In those chaotic months of 1943 and 1944, many collaborators were dragged from hiding, tried, and executed. Yet Antonina's name remained a phantom in the files. She had vanished into the fog of war, swallowed by the chaos of retreating armies and shifting borders. And this was the first miracle of her survival. While countless other collaborators were exposed and punished, Antonina slipped through the cracks. But what was she now? A fugitive? A survivor? Or still a predator, waiting for the next opportunity? The answer, in a way, was all three. Because after Königsberg, after the retreat, after the ashes of war settled, Antonina Makarova, the woman who had executed hundreds of her own people, would begin the long process of erasing her past. She would build a new identity. She would start over. And for decades, no one would suspect that the quiet Soviet woman they knew had once been Tonka, the machine gunner. The collapse of the Reich gave her not just freedom, it gave her anonymity. But the ghosts of Lokot were not so easily buried. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Antonina Makarova was no longer Tonka the machine gunner. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Königsberg, the city where she had been drifting in the fog of retreat, was now burning under Soviet control. The Red Army stormed through, and collaborators, informants, and anyone with a suspicious past were being rounded up. For Antonina, capture meant only one thing: certain death. But she had learned how to improvise. Somehow, she had managed to steal a Soviet military ID, a soldier's booklet belonging to a nurse from the 422nd Medical Battalion. In its pages, she forged her story. She had been serving faithfully as a nurse since 1941, tending to the wounded, doing her patriotic duty. The irony was brutal. The woman who had executed hundreds of her own countrymen with a submachine gun now recast herself as a healer, a caregiver, a protector of life. And it worked. With this new identity, Antonina was placed in a Soviet mobile hospital. She slipped into the role with ease, dressing wounds, distributing medicine, quietly blending into the rhythm of war's aftermath. No one asked too many questions. The Soviet Union was littered with orphans, widows, displaced people. Paperwork was chaotic, verification nearly impossible. If you had the right story, the right paper, the right face, you could become anyone. And soon, she became a wife. In the hospital, Antonina met a young sergeant named Victor Ginsburg. He was recovering from wounds suffered in the storming of Königsberg. He was kind, earnest, and deeply scarred by the war. His entire family had been murdered by Nazi death squads in Polotsk. In him, Antonina found something she had lacked for years: stability, perhaps even protection. Within days, they married. She took his surname, shedding Makarova like a snake's skin. From that moment on, she was no longer Antonina Makarova. She was Antonina Ginsburg. It was the birth of her second life. At first, the couple lived in Kaliningrad Oblast, not far from where they had met. Later, they moved closer to Victor's homeland, settling in the small town of Lepel, in Soviet Belarus. There, they built what seemed to all the world like a model Soviet family. 2 daughters were born. They were given a state apartment, privileges, and respect as war veterans. Photographs of Antonina and Victor, smiling, decorated, honored, hung in the local museum as symbols of patriotic sacrifice. Antonina, the woman who had executed children and elders in Lokot, now stood in classrooms, speaking to Soviet schoolchildren about the importance of remembering the war. She recounted patriotic tales, sanitized, rehearsed, unrecognizable from her truth. No one suspected. Her neighbors saw a quiet, reserved woman, a little shy perhaps, devoted to her husband, strict with her children but caring. A woman who had endured hardship like so many others, and emerged respectable, reliable, ordinary. And in the Soviet Union, there was nothing safer than being ordinary. By 1961, Antonina found steady work in the Lepel sewing plant. She rose to the role of quality control inspector, a position of trust. Her husband Victor was the head of one of the workshops, and eventually both daughters also worked there. It was a family affair, woven into the very fabric of the local community. At the factory, she was considered diligent and competent. Her photograph often appeared on the honor board, the wall where exemplary workers were displayed. But behind that image of responsibility, Antonina remained distant. He didn't form close friendships. She rarely spoke of her past. At workplace celebrations, where vodka flowed freely, she sipped little, careful never to drink too much. Co-workers would later recall that she always seemed guarded, as if afraid of letting something slip. One woman, a personnel officer named Fina Tarasic, remembered her as quiet and closed off, someone who smiled politely, worked hard, but never truly opened up. Antonina had a good reason. She knew she was walking on a knife's edge. In the first years after the war, every knock at the door must have filled her with dread. Was it the military police? Had someone survived to denounce her? Had her past caught up? She tried to persuade her husband to move abroad, to Poland, where some of his surviving relatives lived. Perhaps she thought she would be safer there, beyond Soviet records and memories. But the paperwork never came through. They stayed in Lepel, and gradually time dulled her fear. The Soviets never came. No one asked questions. No one mentioned Tonka the Machine Gunner. Perhaps, she began to think, they had truly forgotten. After all, there had been so many collaborators, so much blood, so many atrocities. Could her name, a single name among thousands, really matter? So Antonina relaxed. She allowed herself to breathe. The decades rolled forward. She became a respected worker, a trusted neighbor, a mother of 2 Soviet citizens, a decorated veteran. The lie held, and the world around her, neighbors, colleagues, even her husband and children, believed in the fiction completely. They saw not a war criminal hiding in plain sight, but a quiet, honest woman who had endured much and deserved peace. Antonina herself seemed to believe it too. She rarely looked back. She never spoke of Lokot, never mentioned the executions, never whispered the name Tonka. The war was over. She had survived. She had remade herself. But even in her silence, the ghosts of the past waited. When the Red Army liberated Lokot in September 1943, the stories began to surface almost immediately. Yes, the collaborators had fled. Yes, the Germans had retreated. But the villagers who survived carried memories that refused to die. They spoke of a woman executioner, a woman with dark hair, a heavy gaze, and a cruel streak of coldness in her eyes. They didn't know her real name. They didn't know where she came from. To them, she was simply Tonka the Machine Gunner. And then, she was gone. The NKVD, the precursor of the KGB, began looking for her immediately. They scoured POW camps, interrogated collaborators, searched through records of the dead and the living. But there were almost no details to work with. She was maybe 21 years old, maybe from Moscow, maybe the daughter of a man named Makar. Perhaps she had been killed in retreat, or perhaps, as some whispered, the Germans had whisked her away abroad. The file on Tonka remained open, but as months became years, the trail went cold. For decades, the search for Antonina was kept alive by sheer persistence. Soviet investigators described it later as a case passed down like inheritance. Each new KGB officer who specialized in Nazi crimes would inherit the file. Thick, worn, a collection of witness statements and unanswered questions. They would reopen it, chase shadows, fail to find her, and then archive it again. It seemed hopeless. Until 1976. That year in Bryansk, a man suddenly attacked another in a public square. He had recognized him, not as a random stranger, but as Nikolai Ivanin, the former head of the Lokot prison during the German occupation. The authorities arrested Ivanin, and when he realized the game was up, he didn't bother to deny it. He spoke. In his confession, he described the machinery of collaboration in Lokot, the arrests, the trials, the executions. And among his recollections, he named a woman. She had been the executioner, the one they called Tonka, a woman with whom he had even had a brief romance. For the first time in decades, investigators had a lead. The KGB launched a new search. They pulled records of every Soviet woman named Antonina Makarova, born around 1920. Roughly 250 candidates. They began checking, one by one. But they quickly hit a wall. The real Tonka had never been born with that surname. She had been born Antonina Panfilova, and only acquired the name Makarova because of a mistake at school. Because of that childhood accident, her true identity was invisible to the KGB's filters. She wasn't on their list. And so the search seemed to fail again. At first, they found the wrong woman with the same name. Investigators tracked down another Antonina Makarova, this one living in Serpukhov. They arranged for Ivanin himself to identify her. But the night before he could testify, he committed suicide in a hotel room. Why? No one ever knew for certain. Guilt? Fear? Despair? In any case, the Serpukhov woman was eventually cleared. Witnesses insisted it was not her. The hunt had to start over again. The breakthrough came, unexpectedly, from paperwork. In 1976, one of Antonina's brothers, a man who worked for the Soviet Ministry of Defense in Siberia, filled out a routine form requesting foreign travel. In the form, he listed his siblings. 6 carried the surname Panfilov, but one sister, he noted, was different. Antonina Ginsburg, née Makarova. That small detail, a surname that didn't match, drew the attention of security services. It was enough to reopen the case. The KGB began to quietly investigate. They learned that Antonina Ginsburg was a respected war veteran living with her family in Lapel, Belarus. A nurse during the war, now a factory inspector. Married to a decorated veteran, mother of two. Could it be possible? Could the gentle, quiet, veteran nurse in Lapel really be the butcher of Lokot? The KGB hesitated. They knew the risks. Arresting a decorated veteran, beloved in her community, without proof, that could backfire badly. They needed certainty. So they watched her. For a week, KGB agents trailed Antonina through the streets of Lepel. They watched her leave her apartment, go to work at the sewing factory, return home. She was cautious, reserved, and soon she began to sense something was off. She grew nervous, changed her routines. The investigators decided to pull back. They could not risk her slipping away again. For an entire year, they left her alone. But in that time, they gathered witnesses, survivors, paper trails, threads of evidence that slowly began to form a net. Finally, they set a trap. The first attempt was subtle. The KGB arranged for Antonina to be called into the local military enlistment office, supposedly to update records for a Veterans Award. While there, an undercover KGB officer struck up a casual conversation with her. He asked about her unit, her commanders, where she had been stationed and when. Simple questions. Questions any real nurse who had served in the 422nd Battalion would have known. But Antonina couldn't answer. She stumbled, claimed she couldn't remember because of her bad memory, that the war had been so long ago. The officer noted everything. Still, the KGB needed something stronger. Eyewitness confirmation. In July 1978, they staged a delicate experiment. One of the surviving women who had known Tonka in Lokot was quietly brought to Lepel. From a second-story window, she watched as Antonina was lured outside the sewing factory under a pretense. The woman's face went pale. "That's her," she whispered. "That's Tonka." But one identification was not enough, so the investigators arranged another. This time, 2 more witnesses were brought in. One posed as a clerk in a local administration office, where Antonina was summoned for a supposed pension adjustment. The moment she entered, the witness froze. She knew the face. She knew the eyes. It was Tonka. Meanwhile, outside the building, another survivor sat in a car with a KGB officer. When Antonina passed by, she too confirmed the identification. 3 independent witnesses, 3 separate confirmations. That was enough. On a September day in 1978, Antonina was walking from her workplace toward the office of the personnel department when the trap was sprung. KGB officers moved in. Among them was investigator Leonid Savoskin, who would later recall the moment vividly. She did not scream. She did not protest. She did not collapse in tears. She understood everything immediately, Savoskin said. No fear, no panic, no tears, until the very last moment. After more than 30 years, the woman who had slaughtered prisoners by the hundreds, who had built a new life as a Soviet matron, was finally unmasked. Antonina Makarova, known to history as Tonka the Machine Gunner, was in custody. And now, for the first time, she would face justice. The arrest of Antonina Ginsburg in September 1978 stunned everyone who knew her. Neighbors, colleagues, even her husband couldn't believe that the quiet, respectable woman they had lived beside for decades was being accused of mass murder. But for the KGB investigators who had finally pieced together the puzzle of Tonka the Machine Gunner, the hardest work was only just beginning. Antonina was transported to Bryansk, where she was placed in a detention facility. The authorities feared she might attempt suicide, either out of despair or as a final act of defiance. To mitigate the risk, they put a Nazedka in her cell, a seasoned inmate who was tasked with gaining her confidence in exchange for leniency. What happened next surprised even the investigators. Antonina did not appear broken, desperate, or fearful. According to her cellmate, she was calm, composed, almost indifferent. She openly mused about the future, remarking that she expected, at worst, 3 years in prison. She believed her young age at the time of the crimes, along with the decades that had since passed, would shield her from harsher punishment. She even joked that the hardest part would be moving away and starting fresh after her sentence. And she talked. Perhaps it was the first time in decades that she felt free to tell her story. She boasted to her cellmate about her wartime life, how she had gone dancing, smoked, and drunk heavily with German officers, how she had once been courted by men who admired her fearlessness. She recounted, with disturbing nonchalance, her time in Lokot, the executions, and later her movements through Kaliningrad. To impress the inmate, she even invented stories, like a stash of valuables she claimed to have hidden in a ruined house in the Baltics. For the KGB, these casual confessions were gold. It confirmed what survivors had long said but could never fully prove. Tonka the Machine Gunner was real, and she had lived undisturbed among them for more than 3 decades. When the formal interrogations began, Antonina showed the same cool demeanor. She volunteered to be questioned, answered directly, never flinched, never wept. She truly believed, as she told her captors, that she had nothing to be punished for. "It was war," she said. "I simply did my job." Investigators later recalled how, during reenactments in Lokot, she walked calmly through the square where so many had died at her hands. Local residents, who recognized her instantly, spat at her, cursed her, and called her a murderer. Antonina seemed almost puzzled by their rage. To her, it was all in the past, and she could not grasp why they still carried so much pain. For the survivors, though, the wounds had never healed. Some came forward as witnesses. They described the cold figure behind the machine gun, the piercing eyes that haunted their nightmares for decades. They begged the court to deliver the harshest possible punishment. One man said, "She lives in my dreams. Every time I close my eyes, I see her finger pressing the trigger." Through all this, Antonina remained detached. Not once during the investigation did she ask about her family. Not once did she request to see her husband or daughters. For her, it seemed, the private world she had built in Lepel was irrelevant the moment the past caught up with her. Her husband, Victor Ginsburg, meanwhile, was frantic. Not knowing the true charges, he assumed his wife had been caught up in some bureaucratic mistake. He wrote petitions, demanded her release, even threatened to appeal to Brezhnev himself or to the United Nations. In desperation, he reached out to the Russian diaspora in Israel, which sparked a flood of letters from international human rights organizations to the prosecutor's office. Finally, the KGB revealed the truth to him. They showed him Antonina's written confessions, page after page of her own words. According to accounts, Victor aged visibly overnight. His hair went gray, his face slackened, and those who saw him later said he looked like a man crushed by a revelation too heavy to bear. The trial opened on November 20th, 1978, in the Bryansk Regional Court. Presiding Judge Ivan Bobrikov read the charges. Antonina Makarova, known during the war as Tonka the Machine Gunner, stood accused of murdering 168 people, those whose identities could be conclusively confirmed. In truth, the death toll was far higher, but the Soviet system demanded verified names. The courtroom was tense. Some expected leniency, reasoning that Antonina had lived an exemplary Soviet life for decades. A worker, a mother, a wife of a decorated veteran. 1979 had even been declared the Year of the Woman in the USSR, and some thought this symbolism might spare her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimony, Antonina's own words, and the weight of history bore down on the proceedings. Judge Bobrikov declared her guilty. The sentence, the highest measure of punishment, execution by firing squad. The announcement rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Victor, seated in the audience, broke down in tears. Antonina, in contrast, remained utterly composed. She nodded, as though acknowledging an expected outcome. Not a single tear crossed her face. And yet, in the days following the verdict, she began to write letters, petitions for clemency, appeals for her life to be spared. In each, she requested the same thing: that her death sentence be commuted to a prison term. The Supreme Court rejected them all. Observers noted the striking absence of remorse. She never apologized, never acknowledged guilt beyond a factual, "Yes, I did it." For her, the killings were simply part of the war, an impersonal duty carried out without reflection. Even when the shadow of her own death loomed over her, Antonina clung to the belief that she had done nothing truly wrong. For the survivors, justice had finally spoken. For Antonina, it seemed the verdict was little more than an inconvenience. She remained the same woman she had been in Lukot, detached, practical, and chillingly indifferent to human life. At 6 o'clock in the morning, on August 11th, 1979, the sentence was carried out. Antonina Makarova, Tonka the Machine Gunner, was executed by firing squad. There were no tears, no speeches, no dramatic final moments. She met her end as she had lived most of her life. Quiet, almost detached, with no visible sign of remorse. The woman who once pressed the trigger of a machine gun to mow down her neighbors now stood in front of the barrels herself. In the official records, it was just another execution, but in truth, it marked the end of an era. Her case became the last major trial in the Soviet Union against a collaborator from the Second World War. And uniquely, it was the only one in which the accused was a female executioner. The archives of Soviet justice list only 3 women sentenced to death after Stalin's time, and Antonina Makarova was one of them. Historians would later note another chilling fact. By the number of victims, Antonina may well have been the most prolific female killer in recorded history. She wasn't a spy, nor a commander, nor a figure of political authority. She was a young woman with a machine gun who, over a matter of months, personally executed hundreds of people: men, women, even children. A scale of killing unmatched by any other woman in the Soviet archives. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, as was customary for war criminals. No name, no marker, no flowers. Only the weight of history remained attached to her memory. Back in Liepel, life went on. Her husband, Victor Ginsburg, and their 2 daughters were never formally accused or ostracized. The Soviet state drew a sharp line between Antonina's crimes and the family she built afterward. They were not subjected to any social discrimination, and no charges or claims were brought against them. Neighbors who once admired Antonina now extended sympathy to the people she left behind. Victor continued his quiet life until his death on February 2nd, 1993, carrying with him the unbearable truth of who his wife had really been. And what of Antonina herself? For decades, she lived as an ordinary Soviet woman, a wife, a mother, a factory worker. Her neighbors remembered her as kind, modest, even shy. Yet behind that facade lay a wartime past soaked in blood. Her story leaves us with questions that still stir unease. Was she, as some argue, a victim of circumstance? A confused 21-year-old girl, abandoned by fate in the chaos of war, manipulated by men stronger than her? Or was she, in the end, something darker? A willing monster who embraced power when it was handed to her, and who pressed the trigger not once, but hundreds of times without hesitation. There is no clear answer. Perhaps that is why her case remains so haunting. Antonina Makarova exists in history as a contradiction, the embodiment of 2 irreconcilable identities. On one side, the ordinary Soviet woman, raising children, cooking dinners, and sewing uniforms. On the other, Tonka the Machine Gunner, the executioner of Lukot, who left behind fields filled with the bodies of her own countrymen. Her story lingers not just as a fragment of wartime history, but as a warning. Evil does not always appear in the form of monsters or tyrants. Sometimes, it hides behind the face of a quiet neighbor, a friendly smile, a woman raising her daughters in a small town. And so, we are left with one final, unsettling question. Do we remember Antonina Makarova as a woman with no choice, or as proof that true evil can wear the most ordinary face?